Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is author and historian Lesley Poling-Kempes. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you're an award-winning author. Let me show some of your books. This wonderful one, The Harvey Girls. This is the most popular book about the Harvey Girls.
And that's my first book.
Oh, wow.
It was my first.
And then a book called, look at these covers, they're so beautiful,
Yeah.
Ghost Ranch.
Yeah.
I don't have all of them, I just have a few. This one, which I am dying to read, Bone Horses. What prizes did you get? The Tony Hillerman Fiction Award, the Will Award.
It had an IPPY award for maybe Best Fiction in the West, something like that.
And the Zia Award?
That was for the Harvey Girls, yeah.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. But today, we're talking about your new book, just came out in September,
Yes.
Ladies of the Canyons, A League of Extraordinary Women and Their Adventures in the American Southwest. Thank you for this. Where did this come from?
Well, it came from many years of work on different books, other projects, and the ladies' story emerged really because of Carol Stanley of Ghost Ranch. In the late 1990s when I began researching the book on Ghost Ranch, and I learned that a woman founded and built and created and even named Ghost Ranch in the 1920s. It was not O'Keefe. It became O'Keefe's home. And when I learned about Carol Stanley having been at Ghost Ranch and being forgotten, to look for her story, and it took many years to get her story. And then in looking for her, I found a circle of friends that Carol knew and was with in the American West, and that's when this book, Ladies of the Canyons, really began. I didn't work on it until several years later, but...
Well, you write about 4 independent, well-educated ladies, single ladies of means, who came here to the Southwest and transformed their own lives, but also the life here.
They did.
And
yeah.
the stories that you tell are so extraordinary. Our dear friend Hampton Sides, who wrote Blood and Thunder, a wonderful writer, described your book as part Willa Cather, part Thelma and Louise.
I love that.
I love that too.
Love that. And it's so true because they were good girls when they were young, and they were raised in Victorian America. But then they had to break out of that to come west as single women and pursue things that they either were already passionate about before they came here or learned that they loved, whether it was land or the cultures here, music, building homes. Their worlds just expanded. They found home here.
Well, this is before Georgia O'Keeffe and Mabel Dodge
Yes,
Lujan. I
yes.
mean, there's a kind of a little bit of overlap, but these women were here really in the first 2 decades of the 1900s.
Yes, they predate O'Keeffe here by most of them by 20 years. They were here before World War I. Natalie Curtis, one of the main character, was here, was at least in Arizona and New Mexico by 1903 and 04. So,
in some ways, I felt reading this that they laid a foundation for Mabel Dodge Lujan and Georgia O'Keeffe to do what they did. The foundation had already been established. Tell us who the 4 women that you chose are, and how did you choose those 4?
Those 4. The 4 are Carol Stanley, who was the founder of Ghost Ranch. Natalie Curtis Berlin, her married name was Berlin, who became really a major character because her story's so extraordinary. A musician from New York. And then Alice Klauber, who was a friend of both of theirs from California, and a painter. And Mary Cabot Wheelwright, who was friends with Carol Stanley. And it was just because they became their lives and stories intersected that they became the major characters. But then on top of that, they have wonderful stories. Their life adventures are fairly extraordinary.
I've read the book, and I don't want to give any of them away, but some of the stories we just have to tell because they're wonderful stories. Could you mention maybe one of your favorites, and I'll ask you about one of my favorites.
Okay.
Maybe they're the same one.
They may be. One of my favorite stories is Natalie Curtis and Theodore Roosevelt at the snake dance in Walpi. I mean, that is, for a historian and a writer, it's like a dream to come across that sort of time and place. They met, they were already friends, and they rendezvoused with two separate expeditions coming in on horseback to Walpi, First Mesa, Hopi Land, and to watch the snake dance in 1913. And their encounter together on the desert is wonderful, and it's told by many people because people were interested in what Roosevelt was doing, so there were accounts written of him being there. And then Natalie wrote about it. But they were, they'd both been out in the desert at least 3 to 4 weeks, and they were fairly disheveled, and, they looked like they'd been on a desert expedition when they met. And there's just a wonderful conversation between them when they meet, which is really in first person because Natalie wrote it herself. I didn't even have to imagine what they said. It was recorded.
And some of the detail, because I love this, desert worn is how you describe these people who've been wearing hats and in the sun and dust and everything. But among other things, in her only outfit, there was this axle grease stain.
Yes.
And she thought, as a true lady, well brought up in the East, she could not meet the former president, he was former at that time, with this huge axle stain from climbing onto a wagon or something. So she found out that gasoline could get the stain out. And could you just describe a little bit of
Well, she went looking for gasoline, much to her campmates' amusement, that she cared at all about what she looked like after weeks of who cared what they looked like. And they told her to find gasoline, and that would maybe take the axle grease out of her khaki skirt. And so she went in search of it at one of the government buildings, and did find a cup that a young man siphoned out of the tank for her. Because she didn't know how to do that.
She didn't know where the gas tank was.
She didn't know where a gas tank was or how to do this. And so a young cowboy assisted her with that, and then he rode off, and she was carrying her cup back with gasoline, and she met Roosevelt coming in alone, and there were hundreds of people at Walpi waiting for him, and he came in a different route and avoided them and just met Natalie with her cup of gasoline, and he was as much a mess as she was. And they were very happy to see each other. And shortly after that, he said she needed to meet his son Archie, who had been riding with him. And he called Archie, and a young man came around on horseback. And it was the same man who had gotten her gasoline. So
who crawled under a car for her, got a cup of gasoline, which by now had evaporated, I'm sure.
It had evaporated. And she was both embarrassed and relieved because it really didn't matter what she looked like anymore. But here she'd asked Archie Roosevelt to crawl under a Model T and get her gas.
I'm sure he was delighted to do it, too. But she was such an extraordinary character because she had the musical background.
Yes.
And then she wrote this book called The Indians
Book, yes.
And she was given permission. First of all, she had a letter from Roosevelt when he was president to give her full access to
safe passage, yes, through Indian country, which wasn't just out here. She also recorded both on paper. She had an amazing ability to hear music and write it out, as she began recording on the wax cylinders of an Edison recorder, but it was too difficult to do, especially out in the West. So she began to put it on paper, and she was able to capture it that way. But she did it from Maine to California, nearly every Native American tribe, and Roosevelt enabled her to do that. But she demanded that she help her by giving her this letter that would allow her to essentially break the law being that it was illegal for Native Americans to use their own language and songs and spiritual and religious practices, and for her to record them, they had to break the law. So she went back with a letter, and then she was able to record.
So what did she save from the dust of history? Because this is such an archive, such a treasure. What did she collect?
Well, in the Indians book, which was published in 1907 with a brief foreword by Roosevelt, what she did was she really introduced to non-Native Americans the entire Native American world, and she did it by showing and on paper their songs and translating the words to their songs, and then also giving background to different tribes, how they lived, where they lived. She wanted to preserve what their lives, at least with music and song and story, was like between about 1903 and 1906. And no one had done this. As soon as the book came out in 1907, she became a popular speaker back east. People were it was very exotic what she was doing. They really didn't know what to make of it. And for her, it was just this passionate, self-appointed mission that she had gone on as an ethnomusicologist and as a person that cared deeply about music and people. And then she fell in love with especially the Native Americans of the Southwest. And she wanted their rights protected. And she did ask and insist that Roosevelt lift the assimilationist ban on language and music, which eventually was lifted. And she probably was fairly important with that.
Well, these days there's always a scholarly gap between an anthropologist or an ethnomusicologist, but she was so embraced by the people wherever she went.
She was, and we only have that one clip of her on film from 1913 with Roosevelt that's in the Library of Congress, where we can see her moving and talking, but we don't hear her, and that's as much as I can see of her beyond still black and white pictures. But she must have been quite a force, friendly but firm and driven, and she had a lot of energy and passion, but I think she also liked people and they liked her. She had a lot of friends among many, many Native American tribes and pueblos that lasted her whole life.
And it wasn't just the Native Americans. She also did the songs of the American South.
Yes, she did. And she really was invited after the Indians book came out by people at I think it was called Hampton School in the South. They asked her if she would begin to record and collect African American or colored music, as they called it at that time, and do the same for them as she had done for Native Americans. And she did that.
And one last thing, because we can't spend all of our time on Natalie, although, like you say, she kind of takes over.
She does.
So in Paris, there was a famous folk music expert who was decrying the fact to this international symposium that America had no native music, and she spoke up in French.
She had to speak, yeah.
And that's
Professor Hill from Harvard, and it was at the Sorbonne at the International Congress of Music, I think was the name of it, and there are delegates from all over the world, and Natalie was there she was invited to speak, but she wasn't an official delegate, which Professor Hill was, and she knew he was going to get up and speak about things that she didn't necessarily agree with, but until he actually spoke, I don't think she realized how much she would disagree with what he said. What he said essentially was that Native American and African American music did not count as American folk music because they weren't true Americans. And this enraged Natalie, who was sitting in the audience and had to speak next, and she did get up and give quite a speech in French about why she disagreed with that we did have a folk music, and it was Native American and African American, and it was a wonderful legacy.
Well, we're speaking today with Lesley Poling-Kempes, who wrote Ladies of the Canyon. We're going to have to leave this one lady because we've got three more. I just want to tell you how it enriches even my driving around Santa Fe. You have stories about Mary Cabot Wheelwright, who founded the Wheelwright Museum. And I've always loved that museum. And I've always loved being in the shape that it is. But only through reading your book did I realize how she had to fight to get it in the Hogan shape. It's a museum of ceremonial Navajo life, and obviously a Hogan would be important. Can you just give us the short version?
The short version is that Mary Cabot Wheelwright knew in the late 1920s, early 1930s that she wanted to have a museum that would preserve all of the collections that she had assembled with Hosteen Claw, the Navajo medicine man. And she wanted the Laboratory of Anthropology, which was being built then by John D. Rockefeller, to to really allow her to be part of that. But she would provide the money for her museum, but she also wanted it to be built in the shape of a hogan. And the board of the Laboratory of Anthropology vehemently disagreed with this. They said it wasn't authentic, it wasn't Santa Fe style. It took years and years of haggling before Wheelwright gave up, and the White sisters, who had also given the land to the Laboratory of Anthropology, gave Mary Cabot Wheelwright her land for her museum, and she built the hogan that is the museum, and it won a National Architectural Award in 1937. So her vision was a good one, and now we don't think twice about it.
No.
Of course it should be a hogan.
Yes. And so talk a little about her relationship with Hosteen Claw.
Hosteen Claw, she met in the 1920s, out actually traveling with Carol Stanley, the founder of Ghost Ranch. They were together out in Navajo land, and Mary Cabot Wheelwright very much wanted to meet Hosteen Claw and hear one of his sings and chants. And they had heard that he was somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, and it actually was in a snowstorm when she first met him. And they drove there in cross country with Carol's driver and met Claw. And for Mary Wheelwright, it was, I think, just, it changed her life completely meeting him. They had an immediate connection. Their conversations were very intense right from the beginning. He was extraordinary, and she knew it, and I think he recognized in her someone who sincerely wanted to preserve his knowledge, and he needed to pass on his knowledge. He was getting older, and they began to work together to do that. And she would go and visit Claw in Navajo land, and he also would come and stay in Alcalde at Carol Stanley's first ranch, San Gabriel. He would stay there, and they would work together there to just slowly record what he knew, which was enormous.
Well, it's an amazing legacy to have preserved, and to have preserved it in such a magnificent place as the Wheelwright Museum. It's just, but now she's cropped up many times. Carol Stanley, who was the founder of Ghost Ranch.
Yes.
And you said that being a researcher is like being a tracker.
Yes.
And one of the tragedies of researching women back from the 1900s, early 1900s, is that people would just throw away the woman's letters and keep the men's. And so you had to really, really dig deep to find out everything you found out. Tell us about Carol.
Well, Carol Stanley, she doesn't get into the Southwest until 1915, when she's in her 30s. And prior to that, she had, like Natalie, formally studied music. She was at the New England Conservatory of Music. She was born on Nahant Island to a fisherman's family, but with a grandmother who was a Choate, which was one of the Boston Brahmins. So she had some money and some means to come west, which was the only way a single woman would come into the Southwest. But she was a music teacher, and after her mother and grandmother died, from everything I could read and collect about her, which was through her friends' diaries and letters and journals, was that she just didn't want to be a spinster school teacher living in Boston. She wanted more, and she was friends with Natalie Curtis, who she'd met at the settlement houses in Boston, where they both taught music, and I suspect that's where she met Mary Cabot Wheelwright also. She heard stories about the Southwest from Natalie Curtis and from a friend of theirs, an Episcopalian priest named Canon Winfred Douglas, and she journeyed west with Douglas in 1915 and ended up at the Wetherill Trading Post in Kayenta, Arizona, where she lived for, I think, several months, and had an extraordinary adventure with Louisa Wetherill, an expedition across Monument Valley in search of different witnesses for a trial, and it came up, the only account that Louisa Wetherill ever wrote down on paper of her extraordinary life was about this expedition with Carol Stanley. So
now, to do all this, she had to ride horseback, but when she came out west, she hadn't even been on a horse before.
No.
And we're talking days on horseback.
Days.
But she took to it completely naturally.
She loved it, and Louisa Wetherill says, talks about her and actually says she's a fine woman to be out with, which what a compliment. Louisa Wetherill was born and raised in the West and on horseback, and somehow she felt comfortable taking this music teacher from Boston out with her to find some Ute families that needed to come in and be witnesses for a trial, and Louisa didn't know exactly where they were going, but Carol's first night on an expedition was in Monument Valley, so that was her introduction to the West.
Well, we only have a few minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about the role of the landscape in the West. There's some quotes you have from Willa Cather, talking about beholding, for an Easterner to behold the West. It's a country that drives you crazy with delight. I can't say anything more intelligible than that. And then this metaphor is so beautiful. The senses were too feeble to take it in. Everyone looked up at the sky, and one felt unequal to it, as if one were sitting deaf under waves of a great river of melody. That the beauty
lovely?
And the vastness of the landscape was just mind-blowing to them. So...
And they appreciated it. We certainly can assume there were women that came out west and didn't feel comfortable, and they didn't stay. I mean, they might have traveled through and gone on to Los Angeles, but these women stayed, and it's because they appreciated it. The few letters I have from Carol Stanley express her love for Frijoles Canyon or the Pajarito Plateau or Ghost Ranch in different seasons. Much like we do today, it was important. They loved it. They understood how special it was to be living in that landscape. I think it was important to them to be part of it, and they missed it when they were gone, which is exactly how O'Keeffe would feel 10, 15 years later. She hated leaving, as they did, and longed to come back.
Why was Santa Fe called the City of Ladies, and in what era did that represent?
That was around just after World War I. There were already women here, like Alice Corbin Henderson, Natalie Curtis was here, Carol Stanley was here. The White Sisters then arrived.
Of course, yeah.
And Mary Cabot Wheelwright arrives. Willa Cather is coming and going around World War I and just after, and then Elsie Sargent. And I found that term used by some sociologists who were sort of studying what was it that was going on with these wealthy women from the East and Santa Fe. There seemed to be a lot of ladies here. So she had called it the City of Ladies, and it had been referenced that several times. So it makes sense now. I hadn't heard it until about 5 or 6 years ago.
But it does make sense.
It does make sense.
In this book, it's so impeccably researched, and then you give us a bibliography. You give us notes from many of the quotations. I mean, how long did it take you to do this? So you should be very proud of your work.
Well, thank you. I worked full time on this about 3.5 years, and then several years before that with research. But when I really jumped into it, it was all I did for more than 3 years, and it was very consuming.
But you also have to weave together so many threads, because Mabel Dodge will come in here and then weave that in, and then and then some figures that turn out to be minor figures because you couldn't focus on all of them, but they keep coming through. It's just it's a wonderful tapestry you weave. It
was a lot of threads. There were times when there was kind of a fertile chaos to the project, and you just take a little. I would take just a little piece at a time and not worry about what was coming.
Now, this just came out in September. It's so well received. Are you taking a little break? Are you running headlong into fiction, like your Bone Horses, just because it's so much easier?
I am writing fiction. It is easier. It's still really challenging. I'm writing a sequel to Bone Horses because I'm just better when I'm writing. If I'm not writing, I sort of feel I'm off center, and I love to be working, but it is easier not to be researching and digging and calling a lot of people, and it's nice. It's a nice rhythm to go to fiction after this kind of nonfiction.
And are there threads in Ladies of the Canyon that you think, maybe...
There are.
Yeah.
There are some women I'd like to go back and look at, who intrigue me, and I don't know how much is there. And that's how I felt with these ladies. I kept a folder on them, and over the years I'd think, well, there might be a book there might not. But I sort of had an intuition that there was a lot there.
Yeah.
So I just follow that.
Yeah. So right now it's do you have a title for the sequel to Bone Horses? A working title?
I don't.
Well, we're on a need-to-know basis. So I want to thank you for this book. Our guest today is Lesley Poling-Kempes. It's called Ladies of the Canyon, and the subtitle?
A League of Extraordinary Women and Their Adventures in the American Southwest.
You have really enriched this, not only as a New Mexican and as a Santa Fean, but as a woman, because these are really inspiring stories. And these were extraordinary ladies. And, you know, they built a foundation not only for Georgia and for Mabel, but for us even now. So I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you.
And when your next book comes out, we'd love to have you back.
I'll be back. I love that.
Yes.
Thank you, Lorene.
And I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.